So, how do we spot stories? Well, we've developed a very simple framework for spotting stories. This says nothing about whether it's a good story. It just says that it is a story, okay? Now, and I'm mainly interested in oral stories, so this is the stories I'm hearing. It does work for written stories as well, but I'm mainly thinking about oral stories. So, stories nearly always start with a time marker or a place marker. So, when you hear someone say, "Oh, a couple of days ago," or "on Tuesday," or they might say, "in 1991," or they could have a vague time marker. They can say, "a while back," or "a long time ago." As soon as you hear any of those time markers, there's a good chance you're going to hear a story, right? So you're listening out for those time markers. If it's not a time marker, it's a place marker. Someone will say, "Oh, we were in the boardroom and Bill walked in." Well, that's the beginning of a story, right? So you're listening out. That's the thing that we're sort of trying to pinpoint. The second thing we're listening out for is events. Stories are events. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? Now, if you tell a story that is, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, it will be the most boring story in the world, right? The guys from South Park, has anyone seen, that animation, the South Park animation? Very funny. They worked out that the two words that you need to be thinking about when you put together your events is but and therefore. So this happened, but this happened, therefore this happened. That's a much more interesting story, because stories should have patterns. They should go up and down, and should sort of be like curves. Stories that just go like this are deadly boring. Essentially they're fatal. So we're listening to events, listening for events. Third thing we're listening for is indication there are people involved, right? Well, in a more broad space, it would be characters, right? But we don't, in business storytelling, we don't do, Thomas the Tank Engine or any of those sort of things. We're looking for people. How do we know people are in a story? What do we hear? Names, right? Names. We love names. We much prefer to hear a name than not hear a name, right? And so when you're sharing a story and you don't know someone's name, it's actually quite okay to make the name up and tell them that you've made the name up. There's a wonderful writer called Atul Gawande. He's a surgeon in Boston General Hospital. He's also a writer for the New York Times, one of those sort of underachiever sort of people. But he's written a number of books on what it takes to become a surgeon. And so he'll start off and he tells all stories to do this. He'll start off by saying, Fred appeared at the emergency room with pains in his chest. Fred's not his real name. We took Fred into the emergency area. We started to do some of the tests. Anyway, as the story unfolds, we think to ourselves, gee, I hope Fred's okay, right? Because we want a name to connect it to, just to make it personal, to make it something that, sort of seems human to us. So names are really important. So listening out for names. And the little bubble there is just a representation of dialogue. It turns out the only way you can deliver dialogue is inside a story. And we do it all the time, naturally, very naturally. We'll say things like, did you see what Sakan did yesterday? What he said to me was, and then you do the Sakan dialogue, right? It's just a simple, off-the-tongue approach that we take. So when you hear dialogue, you know you're inside a story. So these are indicators, right? So you're hearing the time and place markers, you're looking for events, you're hearing people and dialogue. So let me give you an example that has all those things, and you tell me whether this is a story or not, okay? So I got up early this morning and got myself ready. I came in here and set up my computer ready for today's talk. What do you reckon? No. If it's a story, it's the worst story in the world, right? It's not a story because it's missing this bit. It's missing something has to be unanticipated, right? Now, if you're steeped in story, sort of knowledge, you might be thinking, oh, but isn't a story a hero facing a challenge and overcoming a challenge? Well, that's a very Hollywood view of storytelling, because there are many stories that don't have that. For example, coincidences. We love coincidence stories. Like this morning, I've been quoting Robert Cialdini's work for the last 20 years. And this morning, I jumped into the shuttle from our hotel to here, and who was in the shuttle? Robert Cialdini. I got to meet him after 20 years. He's right next door talking. See, that's just a little coincidence story, right? And it's not going to blow away the world to be the best story in the world, but we love to hear those little stories, okay? So something unanticipated happened. But to be a business story, it has to have a point, right? So that story about Robert Cialdini doesn't really have a point. So it would be hard to turn that into a business story. So this is our framework. Now, I've got an example. I just taken this out of Mad Men, so the TV series Mad Men. And it's just a small clip, and I want you to see if you can see where the story starts. Don Draper is pitching Hershey bars, actually, and he tells a story. So have a look. Okay, so the story. When did the story begin? Anyone pick it? We're looking for a time marker or a place marker. Say that again? Yes, absolutely. So as soon as he said, my father used to take me down to the drugstore, to look at the candy, that's the beginning of the story, right? And it becomes very visual at that point, right? You can actually see him standing there looking at this array of sweets, sort of contemplating what he's going to do after mowing the lawn. He's getting his head tousled, his hair tousled. Makes it a very visual story. But for us, it's about just knowing that the story starts at that point of the father taking his son down to the store. Of course, right at the end, he then starts to summarize, what it means. He says things like that, this is a symbol of a child's affection. As soon as he gets into that, that's non-story, right? They're out of the story now. The story finished when essentially he finished that tousling of the hair. That was the end of the story. So you really have to get this sort of like a narrative intelligence pinpointed, because I find a lot of people today are saying things like, we need a story of our product. And I'll ask them, I said, what's the story of your product? And they'll say things like, the story of our product is persistence. That's our story. It's persistence. It's about being there every time, every way. And I'm listening going, well, that's not a story. That's just a tagline or something like that. So it has to be in that sort of narrative form so you can get the benefits of storytelling. Pressing the wrong button here. Here we go. So you can't get the benefits of storytelling unless you're actually telling stories. Another one that we really have to think about in terms of an important tip is to get those imagery, you have to get into moments, small moments. So that's what that was Don Draper painting one very small sort of section of time. And that's when you can turn it into something that's visual and something that's emotional. So moments are vital. Okay, let's look at this idea of establishing rapport and the connection story, right? Which is so important. There's two elements to the connection story. When you share a connection story, you're essentially telling your listeners a story about what makes them tick. Something about their character, something about some insight. And the reason why you do that is because people don't really listen to you until they know who you are and why you're there. Right? They want to know, what's driving you, what's really getting you interested in being part of this conversation. And the second part is that a good connection story will demonstrate that you're a little bit like them. Because as it turns out, and this comes from some of Robert Cialdini's work, is that we're more influenced by people who are just like us. He did a terrific experiment in New York. This was many years ago now. But what he did was he took wallets and he put letters written home to parents in the wallet. But he would write the letters in different languages. So he would write it in Italian and then put the wallet with credit cards and money and drop it in the Italian-speaking part of New York. The wallet was nearly always returned, right? But if they took the Italian letter and dropped it into the Chinese part of New York, it wouldn't be returned, or into the Hispanic part of New York. But then if they wrote a letter in Spanish and dropped it in the Hispanic area, it would be returned, right? This idea that we have this affinity with people who are just like us. So when you're sharing a story, you want to be, a connection story, you want to be sharing something that is related to the audience in some way. So I started off with a couple of stories. Told you about my experience at IBM and how I sort of got into storytelling. So I'm sort of giving you a bit about, what makes me tick, what am I interested in. And even some of those stories around Intercontinental and Perch. These sort of give you a bit of a sense of who I am and why am I standing up here in the first place. I remember giving a talk once to a group of scientists, and there was probably about 100 scientists in the room, so I had to think to myself, okay, what connection story would I tell to a group of scientists? Well, early in my career, I actually did some work for the Geological Survey, right? The guys who do all the mapping of geology for Australia. And I was actually helping them build a system to keep track of their data sets, their scientific data sets. Kind of a boring job, actually. But I knew that that was the story that I wanted to tell, because that audience would at least be sort of saying, oh, okay, he's experienced our world a little bit, right? Just a small amount. And once you share that story, you can sort of see the connection that's actually been made. They say the shortest distance between two people is a story, right? So you want to get that story out as quickly as you can.